Jordan Peterson sat down with Alex O'Connor, and Alex O'Connor may have asked the question we've all been wanting to ask in the most direct way that I personally have ever seen.
Thinking clearly and understanding somebody else clearly. I think the reason why I'm excited to speak to you today is because you're someone who celebrates being precise in your speech. And I've always appreciated your desire to make sure that you're really understanding what somebody else is saying. I've made attempts in the past my channel is mostly focused on the philosophy of religion.
Yes.
And I've made attempts in the past to try to understand your worldview.
Yeah,
your religious
some
worldview.
of them.
And I made a video essay. And some of the things I said there, I think, at least one thing in particular, I'd probably think I was wrong about. But what I was trying to do there, I've seen that people would ask you on interviews and podcasts, do you believe in God? Do you think that Christianity is true? And it was sort of, you would sort of struggle.
Really appreciate how Alex asks for clarity pertaining to his worldview. And I really appreciate how directly the question is being posed here. I think this is important. I think for us as Christians, when we engage in conversations, let's make sure that when we ask the question about what someone believes, we're asking it in a very clear and direct way so that we don't misunderstand or misinterpret what it is that they hold to.
What you mean by believe. Most people, modern people, believe that a belief is a description of accordance with a set of facts.
Sure.
Right. Well, I don't think that's what belief means in the religious sense in the least. So I just think that's a non-starter.
For you, it's something to do with what you act out, right?
It has to do with what you believe is what you're willing to die for, fundamentally. It's what you're committed to or live for, if you think about it as life in the most extensive manner. It's a matter of commitment.
So I understand.
Dr. Jordan Peterson says, I don't know what you mean by believe. Most people believe that a belief is a description of accordance with a set of facts. I don't think that's what belief means in a religious sense. What you believe is what you're willing to die for. Belief is a matter of commitment. So I find it's interesting, right? The person who's essentially claiming not to be religious is telling religious people what it means to believe in a religious sense. I like Dr. Jordan Peterson. I really do. I appreciate his conversations. I appreciate how he's approached these conversations. Seems to be very open-minded, and he's going deep, right? He's not trying to stay on the shallow end. He really wants to engage and have, deep conversations. But honestly, trying to tell religious people what they mean from a religious sense doesn't make too much sense from someone who is, by all definitions, on the outside looking in. Also, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that both his wife and daughter have come out as Christians. His wife is Catholic, and his daughter is Protestant. So why not just sit down with them and ask them what it is that they mean? Well, what do you mean when you say believe? You have a direct connection there, right? Someone that's you're probably with all the time. Now, to be fair, he's not saying that all religious people think this way. Just to be clear, to believe something does mean to adhere to certain facts about something. It just doesn't stop there. As far as what you believe, it's what you are willing to die for. I really do think that is fair. I also think that this adds more credence to the Christian worldview, considering that the early disciples and apostles were martyred for their belief. It doesn't make sense that they would be willing to die for something that they knew was a lie, and it wouldn't benefit them in any way. They had first-hand knowledge. They would have known this was true or not. So it doesn't make sense for them to go through all of this if it was indeed a lie. His point that belief is a matter of commitment, I wholeheartedly agree with this. And I think too many people profess Jesus and live lives that do not reflect this belief.
View of reality.
But you understand surely that when somebody asks, do you believe in God? Although they're asking the sort of subject of the belief is a much more grand entity. The word belief itself, for them, at least in their question, even if you think it's an inappropriate question, they mean something much more mundane. They mean like you believe in the existence of a chair.
It's hard to know. It's hard to know what people mean. Like one of the things I've noticed, for example, is there are no shortage of Christian trolls, right? I mean, there are atheist trolls and there's engineering trolls. There's lots of trolls, but there are Christian trolls. And the Christian trolls, when they ask that question, and it's often the Christian trolls who ask that question, what they mean is, are you in my club?
Exactly.
Right. And my answer is, I'm not even sure you know what club you're in. So
Christian trolls, if you're asking Jordan Peterson this question in an attempt to trap him, please stop. It's not helping. He seems to be surrounded by Christians who are biblical, and those conversations are probably the best approach when trying to speak with him. And I do agree about the whole club thing. I think some people, they get caught up in, oh, are you on our, from a Christian perspective, the two dominant ideas is, at least here in the West, Christian, Catholic and Protestant. So are you team Catholic or are you team Protestant? Honestly, based on the people he's surrounded with, you'll probably be neither of those two.
Do that because it does get to the core of the matter that you were attempting to untangle, let's say, in your essay.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of and I had to sort of piece together different things you'd said in different interviews. And I suppose the reason I had to do that was because I didn't have you in front of me. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity now. It seems to me that when you speak of God, you mean something like that which is at the, I don't know if you'd rather say the basis or the top, but the basis or the top.
Both metaphors.
Of a value hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And it begins with the recognition that anything that anybody does requires some kind of value. Even just to do something as simple as sitting in a chair or picking up a glass.
Well, you don't do anything without it being oriented towards a value.
Exactly, right. And so even to perceive the glass, it's something you've spoken about before. Why do I see the glass as one object? Even though it's got multiple parts, it's got a side and a bottom and a top. I see them together in a way that I don't see the cup and the table as one object. Well, you said before, it's because I can grip it. It's sort of functional. It's because I can use this cup. And the reason that I see it in that way is because I can then drink from it. And the reason that I want to do that is because I sort of value my health. And there's sort of a value regress that goes on.
Always.
And more broadly, this comes out in the question of why you're writing an essay to get a good grade, or why do you want a good grade to get a good job? Why do you want a good job to get money? And you keep going back and back. It has to terminate somewhere.
That's right.
Because otherwise there would be nothing to sort of lend that value.
Well, otherwise you'd always be in an infinite regress.
Further down.
Right? You just die of questioning.
Or it would be infinite. Yeah, you literally, it's the kind of regress in which the value that you have for A actually borrows the value from B. You don't value A at all without B. So it doesn't get it without B. And B doesn't get it without C. And C doesn't get it without D. So if that went on infinitely, there's nothing to give the entire sequence value in the first place.
Right.
And so there's got to be something at the basis here. And then you said, at least on one occasion, that we'll call that place, whatever's at the top there, we'll call it the divine place.
Yeah,
and you said we'll make that
a matter of definition. Yeah.
Now, I'm fine with this.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that what you're doing is you're giving a definition of God that makes him
partial definition,
or makes it him, whatever, unavoidably exist. And also makes it a quite different entity to the entity described by a great deal of, for instance, your Christian listeners, who will say that God is not the basis of a value hierarchy. God is an omnipotent, omniscient, agential being with consciousness that intentionally brings about human beings and sent down a physical man to sacrifice his life in order to save us from our sins. Now, that means that when someone asks you, does God exist? And you say, well, look, I think that's almost an inappropriate question. At times you sort of imply that you don't even believe in atheists because you sort of act as if you believe in God. If what you mean by God is just...
Well, Dawkins himself admitted he was a cultural Christian.
That's another matter, because that's much more specific. I mean, that's cultural Christianity, right? This is just... But
it's a reflection of the same problem.
But when a Christian says to you, I'm being very clear that that's what I mean by God. I don't know if you do believe in the omniscient, omnipotent, agential being, but... If you start talking about the inevitability of believing in some basis of a value hierarchy,
not so obvious.
You're talking about something different.
It's not so obvious from the traditional Judeo-Christian perspective that God is properly conceptualized as a being.
That's probably right.
So it's tricky, right?
Again, shout out to Alex for asking this question so clearly and directly. Let's also acknowledge how this question about value, right? They're talking about this whole value hierarchy, is solely derived from a Judeo-Christian worldview. I mean, sure, you can try to ground it in other worldviews, but it doesn't hold that much weight if there is no objective standard to ground it on. I just want to emphasize how this whole idea of value doesn't make much sense without a personal God, which is what those three qualities are describing, right? This omnipotent, omniscient, and agential being that describes a personal God. So obviously, Alex is not a Christian, right? Shocker. So when he says that God sent down a physical man, that's not what Orthodox Christians believe. We'll get some grace here because, like I said, he's not a Christian. And I do appreciate how he has a really good grasp on what Christians believe overall. We believe that God the Son took on human flesh and willingly gave his life for us. That's why the concept of the Trinity, as described in Orthodox Christianity, is so important. It's an essential Christian belief. This leads us to the next point that Jordan makes about it not being so obvious from a Judeo-Christian worldview that God is a being. I will push back on this, and he does go on to clarify later on in the video. But throughout the Old Testament, we see that God is an agential being, to use the language they used in the video. That's one of the things that sets the God of the Bible apart from these other ancient gods. The God of the Bible values creation. He cherishes creation. He delights in it. He wants to see his creation flourish. The same cannot be said about the other so-called ancient gods, right? Particularly the Greek gods. They were not good, or they were both good and evil.
Existence in the Judeo-Christian tradition that God is outside of the categorical structure, right? Like seriously outside. Elijah, the prophet, establishes that God is not in nature. He's not in the earthquake. He's not in the conflagration. He's not in the storm, right? So that doesn't mean that nature doesn't speak of God, but it does mean that whatever God is not in the natural world. Okay, now we can extend that. Not bound by time, not bound by space. Well, does that make God a material object? Because when people say, is God real, which is a variant of the question, do you believe in God? It's like, well, God's immaterial and outside of time and space. So if your definition of real is material things in the domain of time and space, then we're not talking about the same thing. Now, usually people approach that.
So God is outside of the categorical structure. God is not in nature. But that doesn't mean that nature doesn't speak about God, right? I think, that Psalm 19 comes to mind. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies are the work of his hands, something along those lines. So yes, God is immaterial and outside of time and space. Great. This is correct. Christians are not pantheists. We don't believe that God is the same as creation. I do think that overall he does a really good job of describing what the Judeo-Christian view on God is. And he does clarify what he means by being. And he's saying that people seem to take this as in something physical. I guess the question that arises, if you know that this is essentially what Christians are asking, why the struggle to answer when being directly asked? You understand the concept. You understand what's being presented here. Why the struggle? Now, I can see how this would be difficult in a brief conversation, right? You're passing by somebody, you're at the airport. Oh, well, look at the airport. I guess you might have more time to have a conversation, but maybe you're standing in line for coffee or whatever. So I can see how this would be difficult to answer in a brief conversation. But when you're sitting down for a podcast, it does give you the opportunity to ask clarifying questions and provide clarity on your answer.
That this has happened many, many times, that God has vanished, disappeared. And one of his explanations for that is that a God that's too ineffable, so that's completely outside of the categories of time and space, let's say, and who doesn't make himself present as a being, who doesn't have a heavenly council, who has no hierarchy between the pinnacle and earth itself, tends to float off into space. It becomes so abstract that you can't have a relationship with it, and then...
Not to sound repetitive, but again, I think this is where the view that God is triune really helps answer this question, right? I think it provides an answer to this. What he is describing, in my opinion, has more in common with deism, what Jordan Peterson is mentioning here. This whole idea that it's so abstract that you can't have a relationship with it has more aligned with deism. Honestly, this, in a sense, also describes Allah and Islam. This is what truly sets Christianity apart, that God wants us to be in relationship with him. We see this first in the garden with Adam and Eve. Sin creates a barrier in this relationship with a holy God. So God the Son takes on human flesh so that our relationship to him can be restored. Now, I could be wrong about this, but I think this gives space for God to remain ineffable while also giving space for him to reveal himself to us.
And that's why I think for a lot of Christians, the more important question for you and the question that they're interested in, and you're quite right that a lot of people are like, I want to get you on my team.
Yeah.
I have no dog in this fight. I'm not a Christian.
Yeah.
But I know that a lot of Christians are frustrated when they begin asking about Jesus, who's a much more physical entity, right? It's a real human being. It's someone of flesh and blood. It's someone who's physically crucified by the
It's a
Romans.
very different question. It's very different question.
And then is seen as a physical entity, at least according to the canonical tradition, by his disciples after he died.
Yeah.
So when somebody asks you, do you believe that happened? And when I've seen you ask about that question, you tend to still speak in terms of the psychological and the mythological. I think the frustration is that, as you've just said,
Yeah,
these are
I
two
don't
different
mind
conversations,
frustrating
right?
Christians in that regard either, because the truth of the matter is, with regard to the gospel accounts, that the mythological and the historical are inextricably cross-contaminated.
Sure.
There's no pulling out the historical Jesus, right? That's a non-starter. And why that is, I don't know. It's very mysterious. It's very hard to understand, as are the, let's say, the accounts of the resurrection. Okay, so what do I think about that? Well, I think that denying the historical reality of Christ I think that's just a fool's errand. I
Of
don't
course.
know why anybody would bother with it.
So a man exists called Jesus. We have that much.
Now, there's a claim that is attributed to Christ that he is the embodiment or the incarnation, the fulfillment, let's say, of the prophet and the laws.
Yes.
I think that's true.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. What does that mean? Well, I think it's in the Gospel of John. I think Gospel of John closes with a statement that's something like, if all the books that were ever written were written about the gospel accounts, that wouldn't be enough books to explain what had happened.
Yeah, if
Yes.
all the things that Jesus did.
Yeah. And there's a truth in that. The truth is that profound religious account is bottomless. And the biblical representations are like that. There's no limit to the amount of investigation they can bear, not least because the text itself is deeply cross-referenced. So there's an innumerable number of paths through it. It's like a chessboard. And so it's inexhaustible in its interpretive space.
That's true.
And that's a problem too, because it means it's also susceptible to multiple interpretations. The thing about the resurrection accounts is that they're all, look, so I could say something like this, which will just annoy people, but it doesn't matter. I believe the accounts, but I have no idea what they mean.
When you say you believe the accounts, do you mean, and I hate to be sort of pedantic here, it seems pedantic, but do you mean you believe that these are things that happened, such that that's a strange
I
know you don't
thing.
like that. Let me put it this way.
Yeah.
If I went back in time with a Panasonic video camera and put that camera in front of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would the little LCD screen show a man walk out of that tomb?
I would suspect yes.
So that to me seems like a belief in the historical event of the resurrection, or at least of Jesus leaving the tomb, which means that when somebody says, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? It doesn't seem clear to me why you're not able to just say, it would seem to me yes.
Because I have no idea what that means. And neither did the people who saw it.
Oh, man. Come on. I wish I could say we get a whole lot of clarity here with Jordan Peterson's response. We get some, but probably not as much as we would like. I really appreciate how Alex asks his questions in this conversation. And I think overall, he has a good grasp on what Christians believe. And I'm thankful for that. Jordan Peterson talks about now being able to separate the myth from the historical in the gospel accounts, and trying to pull the historical Jesus out of there doesn't make much sense. Completely agree. It seems silly to try to separate Jesus apart from his miracle claims, the miracles that he does in the gospel. It doesn't make much sense to do that. There doesn't seem to be a lot of value in it personally. So the question is, what does he mean by mythological? Channeling or inner Jordan Peterson here. Well, what do you mean by mythological? Mythological doesn't mean now what it meant then. So I think it will be important to clarify what it is that he means. The gospel accounts are the best sources we have for the person of Jesus Christ. So again, just trying to pull out a historical Jesus while ignoring the miracle claims is not the best approach. Now, both Jordan Peterson and Alex are in agreement that Jesus did exist and consider it foolish to argue otherwise. So no Jesus mythicist here. Sorry, Richard Carrier. I do think that Jordan Peterson acknowledging that Christ is the fulfillment of prophets and laws is a huge win, but we should celebrate that. But we can't just stop here though, right? What does that mean? what would it have meant to ancient Jews? The people there were looking forward to something. They were expecting something, or better yet, a someone. So when the early apostles and disciples are going around pointing out how the person of Jesus did these things, that's a very direct claim. They're saying he is the one. They knew what they were saying. In fact, Peter utters this very thing in the gospel. You are the Christ, the Messiah. Jordan Peterson says, I believe the accounts, but I have no idea what they mean. Well, we're in luck because the writers themselves tell us what they mean. That's good. Also consider that when word got to the religious leaders about what happened, they quickly conspired to say that the disciples took the body, or that to say they knew what they meant. Here's where it gets really crazy. When Alex asks him if a man walks out of the tomb, he says, yes. But then he follows up by saying that he has no idea what it means that Jesus rose from the dead, and neither do the people that saw it. Come on. I like how early on in the conversation, Alex references 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says that if Christ did not rise from the dead, then this is in vain. Your whole belief is in vain, pointless. If you read that whole chapter, I think you get a pretty good idea of what they meant by Jesus rose from the dead. Also, when you factor in how the gospel accounts end, this clarifies what they mean, especially in the Gospel of John, where we see Thomas wanting to put his finger in the wounds to verify that it's truly him. Thomas wants to know, hey, is this Jesus that died? Is this the same guy now that rose from the dead? That's why he wants to touch his wounds. Obviously, he doesn't get to that point. Honestly, a lot of this comes off as all these people were not very educated. How could they know what they were seeing? And to be fair, I don't think he means it that way, but that is kind of how it comes across. It does sound like he is really wrestling with all this, and I think that's good. Jesus tells us to count the cost. I also think it's good that he appears to be surrounded by people who really know and understand scripture, and he is willing to go deep into the text. That's good. Sadly and unfortunately, that's more that can be said for a lot of Christians. Let's end on this note. Hebrews 11, verses 1 and 2. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. Well, thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.